Christmas dinner was supposed to be the one night I didn't have to think about any of it. I'd driven 4 hours through an ice storm to be there. I sat down, poured a glass of water, and asked my dad if the financial aid office had sent the confirmation letter for my nephew's college fund disbursement. He set down his fork, looked at my mom, then looked at me like I'd asked about the weather. "It came," he said, "but we used that money to help your brother get current on his mortgage. He's got a family now, you understand." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I picked up my knife and cut a piece of turkey. "So you still don't know whose name that account is actually in," I said. My mom went very still. My brother stared at his plate. My dad's jaw tightened. "What does that mean?" I looked up. "It means I think you just made a very expensive mistake. My name is Colt Waverly. I'm 29 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the family's quiet engine, the one who shows up, the one who doesn't make scenes, the one who handles things without being asked and never brings a receipt. I grew up in a house in Boise where being good meant being useful, and being useful meant being invisible. I learned early that love in my family was transactional. You gave until you were needed, and when you weren't needed anymore, you faded back into the wall. I was okay with that arrangement for a long time, or I told myself I was. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever quietly paid for something no one knew about, hit subscribe. This story isn't over yet, and I need people with me for the rest of it. My nephew, my brother's son, is 12 years old and already the most serious kid I've ever met. He reads history books for fun, he draws maps of places he's never been. He has a question for everything, and he waits for the answer before he asks the next one. His name is Luca, and about 18 months ago, I realized that the house he was growing up in was going to swallow him whole. My brother and his wife aren't bad people in the way that word usually means. They're not cruel, they're just drowning. My brother makes decent money but spends faster than he earns. His wife cycles through moods that nobody in the family is allowed to name. Their house is loud in the wrong way, and Luca navigates it like a kid who learned very young that the floor might shift under him at any moment. He's quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when a child figures out that speaking up costs too much. I watched this for years and said nothing, because that's what you do in my family. You don't name the problem, you work around it. Then about 18 months ago, I was visiting over spring break, and I found Luca sitting at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning, alone, reading a brochure for a boarding school in Vermont. He'd printed it himself from the school's website. He'd circled the application deadline in red pen. He wasn't crying. He wasn't dramatic about it. He just looked up at me and said, "I did the research. I think I could get in." I sat down across from him. I asked him how long he'd been thinking about this. He said since he was 9. He was 11 at the time. I didn't say anything to my brother. I didn't say anything to his wife. I didn't say anything to my parents. I went home to Portland, opened a savings account I'd never mentioned to anyone, and started moving money into it. Not big amounts, nothing that would catch anyone's attention on a shared statement. A few hundred here, a bonus check there. Freelance work I billed through a separate email. I worked in tech consulting, which meant my income was lumpy and unpredictable, in ways that made it easy to keep this quiet. I worked extra contracts. I cut my own expenses down to almost nothing. I ate at my desk. I canceled the vacation I'd been planning. I told myself it was temporary. The account was in my name. I set it up as an education savings fund, with Luca listed as the beneficiary. The school's financial aid office had a process for families where a third party was the custodian of the account. I went through that process carefully. I got everything documented. When I was done, the fund had enough for 2 full years, with financial aid potentially covering the rest. I submitted Luca's application materials myself, with his help, over 2 long weekends when he told his parents he was studying at my place. He wrote his own essay. I barely touched it. It was about maps. It was one of the best things I've ever read. He got in. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. I needed one more thing to fall into place before the whole picture made sense. The school required a formal confirmation of financial backing from whoever held the account before they would send a conditional acceptance letter. That letter was supposed to arrive in early December. I'd asked my parents if I could have it sent to their Boise address, since I was between apartments at the time of the original application, and the paperwork required a stable address for the custodian. My parents knew I had some kind of account with their address on file. They thought it was mine, a savings account, something minor. They didn't ask questions, which was typical. The acceptance letter arrived. So did the confirmation of financial backing. and apparently both sat on the kitchen counter for a week before my dad saw the word education fund and decided the money described in the confirmation document belonged to the family to allocate as they saw fit. He and my mom talked to my brother. My brother told them he was 4 months behind on his mortgage and that his wife's family wasn't in a position to help. My parents decided the family fund should go toward keeping my brother's house. Nobody called me, nobody asked. My dad withdrew everything he could access, which was nothing, because the account was in my name and he didn't have access, but he did contact the financial aid office at Luca's school and told them he was acting on behalf of the family and that the account was under dispute and that the financial backing confirmation should be considered void pending family resolution. I didn't know any of this at Christmas dinner. I just knew the letter hadn't arrived at my new Portland address as expected, and I was asking where it was. When my dad said, "We used that money to help your brother," I felt something go cold in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something more like recognition, like watching a card trick and finally seeing the hand. I excused myself from the table and called the financial aid office from the bathroom. It was a Friday evening, so I got voicemail, but I left a message that laid out the situation in specific terms. I was the account holder, I had documentation, and any communication from any third party should be considered unauthorized. I sent a follow-up email from my phone before I came back out. I sat back down. I ate the rest of my dinner. My mom asked if everything was okay. I said I just needed to make a call for work. After dinner, I cornered my dad in the kitchen while he was loading the dishwasher. I asked him exactly what he'd told the school's financial aid office. He looked genuinely confused for a moment, then defensive. He said he'd explained to them that there was a family disagreement about the account. He said it like this was a reasonable thing to have done. He said Luca's school was an extravagance, and that my brother needed the money more, and that I needed to understand that family meant making sacrifices for the people who actually had responsibilities. I said, "Dad, that account has Luca's name on it as beneficiary. You don't have access to it. You don't have authority over it. And what you told that school may have just cost him his spot." He told me I was being dramatic. He told me I needed to stop treating money like it was mine to control. He said the word selfish 3 times in 4 sentences. I left that night, drove back to Portland in the dark. The next 2 weeks were the most focused I've ever been in my life. I wasn't emotional. I was methodical in the way you get when you finally accept that the problem is real, and you're the only person who's going to solve it. First, I called the financial aid office first thing Monday morning and spent 45 minutes on the phone with the director, whose name was Ms. Farrow. She was patient and precise. She explained that my father's call had flagged the account and put a temporary hold on the acceptance pending clarification. She confirmed that because the account was in my name and I was the sole authorized custodian, my father had no legal standing to dispute or void anything. What he'd done was create administrative confusion, not legal reality. She asked me to send a written statement with copies of the account documentation and a clarification that I was the sole custodian acting in Luca's interest. I sent it the same day. She told me she would review it with the admissions office and get back to me within a week. While I waited, I pulled every document I had: the original account setup, the authorization letters I'd signed when establishing the fund, Luca's application materials, the correspondence with the school, the financial backing confirmation. I organized everything by date in a binder that I kept on my desk and checked 3 times that week, like a person checking on something alive. On day 6, I got an email from Ms. Farrow. The hold had been lifted. The conditional acceptance stood. Luca's spot was secure. I sat at my desk for a while and just breathed. Then I started making phone calls. I called my brother first, not to fight. I called him because I needed to know what he knew, and I needed to hear it in his voice. He picked up on the second ring and immediately started explaining that he didn't ask for this, that he didn't know what Dad had told the school, that his mortgage situation was temporary, and he hated that any of this had blown back on me. He sounded genuinely stressed. He sounded like a man who'd let other people make a decision and was now discovering the shape of the consequences. I believed maybe 60% of what he said, but I also understood something. He wasn't the person who'd called the school. He wasn't the one who'd tried to redirect a fund he had no access to. He was someone who'd taken what was offered without asking how it was sourced. That's its own kind of failure. But it's a different category. I told him I needed him to do one thing: write a short email to my parents clearly stating that he had not authorized any contact with the school on his behalf, and that he wanted no part of whatever family resolution my dad had described. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Okay." That email arrived in my inbox 90 minutes later. I forwarded it to Miss Farrow's office for the file. Then I called a lawyer. A friend of a friend had used someone named Aldrich Voss for a contract dispute and said he was calm and specific in a way she found reassuring. I called him, described the situation, and asked him what my exposure was if my father escalated. He told me that, from what I described, I had strong documentation and my father had essentially no legal ground to stand on. He also said that if my father had genuinely misrepresented himself to a third-party institution in a way that caused material harm, there were civil remedies available. He told me to document every communication from that point forward and to not respond to my parents directly in any format that wasn't written. I sent my parents an email that evening. I kept it short. I told them that the account was in my name, that I was the sole custodian, that the school's hold had been lifted and Luca's spot was secure. I told them that what my father had done by contacting the school was, legally speaking, an unauthorized third-party interference in a financial arrangement I had sole authority over. I told them I was not angry. I told them I was asking them not to contact the school, not to contact Luca, and not to contact my brother about this matter again. I said this was not negotiable. My dad called me 4 times that night. I didn't answer. He left 2 voicemails. The first one was calm and explained that he was acting in the family's best interest. The second one was less calm. He said I was punishing my brother for my own inability to understand how a family works. He said I was treating a 12-year-old kid like a financial asset, and that was a sickness. He said I needed to think very hard about what I was doing to this family. I transcribed both voicemails into a document, attached the audio files, and sent them to Aldrich with a note that said, "For the record." My mom called the next morning. Her approach was different from my dad's. She didn't yell, she reasoned. She explained that the family was under a lot of stress, that my brother's situation was serious, that nobody meant to create a problem for Luca, that surely I understood these things. She asked me to call my dad and work it out. She said she was worried about me. She said I seemed cold lately. She said the family had always figured things out together, and she didn't understand why this had to be different. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "Mom, I need you to understand that Luca got into a school that changes his life. I spent a year and a half making that possible. Dad tried to undo it in one phone call. I am asking you both to step back and let this be what it is." She told me I was being selfish. Same word my dad had used. I said I had to go and ended the call. What happened next took about 3 weeks to fully unfold, and some of it I didn't find out until later. My parents, apparently believing that the money question was still in play, contacted their attorney and asked about their options. Their attorney apparently told them quite clearly that they had no options, because they had no standing. The account was mine, the beneficiary was Luca, and my father's call to the school had been a personal communication with no legal weight. The attorney also, according to what my brother eventually told me, suggested that my father's voicemail to me, the second one especially, was not something he should have on record. My dad called me one more time 2 weeks later. He didn't yell this time either. He said he understood now that he'd overstepped. He said he thought he was helping. He said he was sorry the situation had gotten complicated. He did not say he was sorry for calling the school. He did not ask about Luca. I said, "I hear you." And I meant it as exactly that, and nothing more. I started setting up new parameters. I moved the education fund to a different institution entirely, one with no Idaho address on file for anything. I changed the correspondence email to one my parents didn't have. I set up Luca's school communications to go directly to my Portland address and to a secure email only Luca and I shared. I created a document that outlined my custodianship clearly, had it notarized, and sent a copy to Ms. Farrow's office and to Aldrich's files. I called Luca on a Thursday evening. He was doing homework when he picked up. I told him the spot was secure. There was a pause on his end, and then he said, "Okay," in a voice that was trying very hard not to break. He asked if he still needed to tell his parents. I said I thought we should figure that out together carefully and that we had time. He said okay again. Then he asked me what Vermont was like in the fall. I told him it was cold and beautiful, and that the leaves turn colors you don't believe are real until you see them. He said he had a book about New England that he'd been reading since October. I said that sounded about right. The conversation with his parents happened in January. My brother called me first to give me a heads up that he and his wife were going to tell his parents that night. He sounded nervous. He said his wife was cautiously supportive, which I understood to mean she was staying out of it until she could read the room. My parents' reaction, according to what my brother relayed to me later, was complicated. My mom cried, not with happiness, with something more like grief or embarrassment or both. My dad said very little. He asked who had been paying for it. My brother told him. He said of course, and didn't say anything else for the rest of the meal. I wasn't there for it. I didn't need to be. Luca started at the school in September. I drove him up to campus. We listened to a documentary podcast about cartography the whole way, which was his choice. He had a duffel bag and a backpack and a small crate of books and a map he'd drawn himself of every state we drove through. When we got to campus, he stood in front of the main building for a moment and looked up at it like it was exactly the size he'd expected. He carried his own bags inside. He shook the resident director's hand. He was 12 years old and completely unafraid. I drove home alone and cried somewhere around Hartford. Not sad, just full. My parents and I are not estranged. But the shape of our relationship has changed in a way I don't expect to change back. My dad is polite when I see him. My mom is warmer, but she doesn't ask about the school or about Luca's life there, and I've stopped waiting for her to. My brother and I have gotten closer in a sideways, cautious way. He paid me back half of what the school said they needed that semester. When the mortgage situation stabilized, he didn't make a speech about it. He just transferred the money and texted me a thumbs up, which is about as emotional as he gets. Luca calls me on Sunday evenings. He tells me about his classes. He's joined the school's geography club and a history reading group. And he's made 2 friends he describes with the specificity of a person who doesn't make friends carelessly. Last week, he told me his teacher said his essay on the Louisiana Purchase was the best in the class. I told him that didn't surprise me. He said he knew. Here's what I've come to understand about the past 2 years. My family didn't try to hurt Luca. They don't think of what they did as harm. They think of it as resource allocation, as family logic, as the way things have always worked. And that's exactly what makes it dangerous. Not the malice, but the blindness. The assumption that any money adjacent to the family's needs belongs to the family to sort out. The assumption that a child's future is a line item, negotiable, movable. The assumption that I would understand, that I would absorb it, that I would find another way because I always find another way. I used to believe that keeping the peace was the same as having peace. I know now that's not true. Keeping the peace means absorbing the cost of other people's choices so they never have to feel them. And I did that for a long time, quietly without complaint, because it felt like love. It wasn't. It was just habit dressed up as loyalty. What I did for Luca wasn't noble. I didn't set out to make a statement, or win anything, or prove a point. I just looked at a kid who had circled a deadline in red pen and decided he deserved to make it. Everything else followed from that. You don't have to blow up your family to stop sacrificing yourself for it. Sometimes you just have to stop making yourself the solution to every problem they create. Sometimes you have to hold something quietly and carefully and not let go of it, even when the people around you can't understand why it matters. Sometimes the most important thing you do is the thing nobody sees until it's already done. If you're carrying something like that right now, something you've been protecting alone because you know no one else will, I want you to know that it counts. Even when it's invisible, even when it costs you, even when the people who should have helped you are the reason you had to do it alone. It counts. Don't put it down.